The street corner near Central Park had been his home for almost 3 years now. Not that he ever called it home, it was just where he existed. The man with the weathered face and kind eyes had a name, but most people didn't bother to ask. They would walk by, avoiding eye contact, clutching their bags a little tighter as if he might suddenly lunge for them. At 52, he had seen better days. Much better. 10 years ago, he had a job at a construction company, a small apartment, and even a cat named Whiskers. Then came the accident at the work site. A steel beam, improperly secured, came crashing down. He pushed his coworker out of the way just in time, but couldn't save himself. The injuries weren't fatal, but they were severe enough to keep him from working heavy labor ever again. The medical bills piled up. The insurance company fought his claim. The pain medication prescribed by doctors became both a relief and a prison. Within 2 years, he had lost everything, his job, his apartment, and eventually, he had to give Whiskers to a neighbor when he couldn't even afford cat food anymore. Now, his worldly possessions fit into a worn backpack and a small cart he had found discarded behind a grocery store. He kept himself as clean as possible, using public bathrooms to wash up. The local shelter was an option on the coldest nights, but he avoided it when he could. Too many people, too much noise, too many rules. It was a crisp autumn day when he first saw her. Unlike the others who hurried past his corner, she walked with purpose but without the usual fear. She wore expensive clothes, not flashy, but the kind of quality that spoke of old money and good taste. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than what he used to make in a month. She didn't look at him the first time she passed by. Nor the second. But on the third day, when a sudden gust of wind sent her papers flying from her hand, their paths crossed in a way neither could have predicted. He moved quickly despite his bad leg, grabbing papers before they could scatter too far. She was frantically trying to gather them while balancing her briefcase and coffee. "Here," he said, holding out a stack of rescued documents. "I think I got most of them." She looked up, surprised, not just at the help, but at the clear, articulate voice that didn't match her assumptions about the man she'd been passing on the street corner. "Thank you," she said, taking the papers. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he pulled his hand back quickly, aware of his rough, dirty nails against her manicured ones. "Some important stuff there?" he asked, noticing how relieved she looked to have the papers back. "Yes. Contracts. Real estate deals." "I'm already late for a meeting," she said, organizing the stack. Then she paused, really looking at him for the first time. "I appreciate your help." He shrugged. "No problem." She reached into her purse and pulled out some cash. "Please, take this." He hesitated. He wasn't proud, not anymore. Pride didn't keep you warm or fed, but something about the moment felt different from the usual handout. "Buy yourself something to eat," she added, perhaps misinterpreting his hesitation. He took the money with a small nod. "Thanks." She hurried off, and he watched her go, wondering about the life she led, the meetings, the contracts, the world so different from his street corner. The next day, to his surprise, she stopped at his corner. She was carrying 2 coffee cups. "I wasn't sure how you take it, so I brought cream and sugar packets," she said, handing him one of the cups. He was so stunned he almost didn't take it. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I'm sorry I was in such a rush yesterday. Those papers you saved, they were closing documents for a property my company has been trying to acquire for months. If they'd been lost..." She shook her head. "Anyway, I wanted to properly thank you." He cradled the warm cup in his hands, savoring the heat against his perpetually cold fingers. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She hesitated. "I'm Lena, by the way." He hadn't introduced himself to anyone in a long time. "Mike," he said after a moment. She smiled. "Nice to meet you, Mike." That brief exchange was the beginning. Lena stopped by his corner every few days after that, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with a sandwich. They didn't talk much at first, just a few words about the weather, or the noisy construction down the block. But gradually, the conversations lengthened. He learned she was a real estate developer, specializing in commercial properties. She had come to the country as a child, worked her way through college, and built her company from nothing. Now she was one of the most successful developers in the city, known for her shrewd business sense and ethical practices. She learned he had been a foreman before his accident, that he had grown up in a small town upstate, that he could still name every constellation in the night sky from his childhood hobby of stargazing. One day, about 3 weeks after they'd first spoken, Lena arrived at the corner looking troubled. "Everything okay?" Mike asked. She sighed. "Not really. One of my project managers quit suddenly. We're in the middle of renovating a building downtown, and now I have no one to oversee the work." Mike nodded sympathetically. Though their worlds were vastly different, he understood workplace stress. "What kind of renovations?" he asked. "Converting an old warehouse into mixed-use space, apartments above, retail below. But the contractor is cutting corners, and without someone who knows construction watching them." She trailed off. Mike hesitated, then spoke. "I used to catch guys doing that all the time. There are tricks they use, thinking no one will notice." Lena looked at him with sudden interest. "Like what?" "Like using cheaper materials than what's specified. Or skimping on insulation where it won't be visible. Small stuff that adds up." Their conversation shifted, becoming more technical. Mike found himself explaining construction practices, revealing his extensive knowledge gathered over decades in the industry. Lena listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that showed her own expertise. As the sun began to set and the fall air grew chillier, Lena checked her watch. "I should go." "But Mike." She paused, seeming to wrestle with a thought. "Would you be willing to look at some plans? Give me your opinion? I'd pay you as a consultant, of course." The offer hung in the air between them, a small bridge between his world and hers. "I haven't looked at blueprints in years," he said slowly. "But you could, couldn't you?" He thought about it. His knowledge was still there, locked away but not lost. Yeah, I could." "Tomorrow then? There's a coffee shop around the corner. More comfortable than standing here." Mike looked down at his dirty clothes, his worn shoes. "I don't exactly blend in at coffee shops these days." Lena waved away his concern. "It's my regular place. No one will bother you." As she walked away, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: anticipation. Tomorrow would be different from today, and that possibility, however small, sent a current of energy through him that even the approaching cold night couldn't diminish. The next morning, Mike woke before dawn, as he always did. Sleep never came easily on the streets, too many noises, too many dangers. But today was different. Today he had somewhere to be. He made his way to the public bathroom in the nearby park. The early hour meant he had it to himself, a rare luxury. He washed as thoroughly as possible, scrubbing his face and hands with the harsh soap from the dispenser. He ran wet fingers through his beard, wishing he had a way to trim it. From his backpack, he pulled out his cleanest shirt, a faded blue button-down that someone had donated to the shelter last winter. By the time he reached the coffee shop, it was just after 8. He hesitated outside, watching through the window as people in business attire ordered their morning drinks. His reflection in the glass window reminded him how out of place he would look. For a moment, he considered walking away. What was he thinking? This wasn't his world anymore. But before he could leave, he heard her voice. "Mike! You came." Lena was approaching from down the street, her face bright with a smile he hadn't seen before. She was carrying a small shopping bag along with her usual briefcase. "I said I would," he replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. She nodded, seeming to understand his discomfort. "I thought we might start somewhere quieter. My office is just around the corner. Would that be okay?" He nodded, relief washing over him. As they walked, she handed him the shopping bag. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "Just a few things that might be useful." Inside were a new toothbrush, toothpaste, a razor, some deodorant, and a crisp white t-shirt still in its packaging. "The restroom at my office is private," she added. "If you wanted to freshen up before we look at those plans." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught him off guard. She hadn't made a big deal of it, hadn't made him feel like a charity case. It was practical, respectful. "Thanks," he said simply, but the word carried more weight than usual. Lena's office was in a converted brownstone, elegant but not flashy. Her company name, Parkview Properties, was displayed in understated letters on the door. The receptionist looked up as they entered, her professional smile faltering slightly when she saw Mike. "Good morning, Ms. Wong," she said, eyes darting between them. "Morning, Diane. This is Mike Chen, a construction consultant I've brought in for the waterfront project. We'll be in the conference room. Could you hold my calls until 10? The ease with which Lena introduced him, giving him both a name and a purpose, made Mike stand a little straighter. Chen wasn't his last name, but he understood why she'd done it. It was easier this way, less explaining to do. "The restroom is down the hall on the right," Lena told him, pointing the way. "The conference room is at the end. Take your time." In the privacy of the clean, well-lit bathroom, Mike looked at himself in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in months. His eyes were the same blue they'd always been, but the face around them had aged beyond his years. His beard was streaked with gray, his skin weathered from constant exposure to the elements. He washed, shaved, changed his shirt. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. Without the layer of grime, without the wild beard, he looked more like the man he used to be. The man who knew about construction, who had skills and knowledge. When he entered the conference room, Lena was laying out blueprints on the large table. She looked up and paused, a small smile forming. "There you are," she said. "Coffee?" She gestured to a tray with a carafe and cups. He nodded, approaching the table cautiously. The blueprints called to him, familiar territory in an otherwise foreign land. "Black, right?" she asked, pouring. "You remembered," he said, surprised. "I pay attention," she replied, handing him the cup. For the next 2 hours, they pored over the plans. Mike pointed out areas of concern, places where the contractor might take shortcuts. His knowledge came back to him fully as he explained load-bearing walls, proper insulation requirements, electrical code compliance. Lena took notes, asked questions, treated him like the expert he once was. By the time they finished, they had compiled a list of key inspection points and potential issues to watch for. "This is exactly what I needed," Lena said, gathering her notes. "You've just saved me from making some costly mistakes." Mike felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. It had been so long since he'd been useful, since his knowledge had mattered. "The contractor's scheduled to start the major renovations next week," Lena continued. "Would you be willing to visit the site with me? See things firsthand?" The question hung between them. This wasn't just about today anymore. This was potentially an ongoing arrangement. "I'm not exactly dressed for a job site," Mike said, gesturing to his worn jeans and borrowed t-shirt. "We can fix that," Lena replied. She opened a drawer in the conference room and pulled out an envelope. "Your consulting fee for today. $500. Mike stared at the envelope. It was more money than he'd held at one time in years. That's too much, he said. It's the standard rate for a construction consultant with your experience, she countered. I don't believe in underpaying for expertise. He took the envelope slowly, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. There's a clothing store down the block, she added. Nothing fancy, but they have work clothes, boots. If you're going to be on a job site, you'll need the right gear. You're serious about this, he said, still processing. I am. The waterfront project is important to me, Mike. It's not just another development. We're creating affordable housing units along with the retail space. I need someone I can trust to make sure it's done right. Trust. The word resonated. She trusted him, a man she'd met on a street corner. Why me? He asked finally. You could hire anyone. Lena considered his question. Because you have nothing to gain by hiding problems. Because you know what shortcuts look like from the inside. And because you helped me when you had no reason to expect anything in return. She glanced at her watch. I have a meeting across town. Take some time, think about it. If you want the job, meet me at the corner tomorrow morning at 8. After she left, Mike sat alone in the conference room, the envelope in his hand, possibilities spread before him like the blueprints on the table. When he finally walked out of the office building, the world looked different. The same streets, the same people rushing by, but he moved through it all differently. He had a purpose, a direction. For the first time in years, he had tomorrow to look forward to. The clothing store clerk didn't bat an eye when he came in. Money was money, after all. He bought 2 pairs of sturdy work pants, several plain shirts, thick socks, a belt, and a pair of steel-toed boots. The clerk threw in a canvas tote bag for his purchases. That night, instead of returning to his usual corner, Mike used some of his remaining money to pay for a room at a budget hotel. A real bed. A hot shower. Small luxuries that had become unimaginable over the years. As he lay in bed, clean and with a full stomach for the first time in longer than he could remember, Mike thought about what Lena had said. Trust. Purpose. A chance. Tomorrow morning at 8. He'd be there. The waterfront project site was a massive old warehouse that took up nearly half a city block. Once a bustling hub for the shipping industry, it had sat abandoned for almost 15 years, its brick exterior crumbling, windows boarded up, a monument to urban decay. Now, surrounded by construction equipment and workers in hard hats, it was coming back to life. Mike stood at the entrance beside Lena, both of them wearing yellow hard hats with the Parkview Properties logo. His new work boots felt stiff but solid under his feet. The clothes he'd bought yesterday were clean and proper, not fancy, but respectable. Working man's clothes. Impressive, isn't it? Lena said, gazing up at the building. It was built in 1924. Those brick walls are 2 feet thick in some places. Mike nodded, studying the structure with a professional eye. They don't build them like this anymore. Solid craftsmanship. That's why I wanted to renovate rather than demolish. There's history here worth preserving. A man in a suit approached them, hand extended toward Lena. Ms. Wong, good to see you again. His smile was all business. We weren't expecting a site visit today. I like to drop in unannounced sometimes, Tom, she replied, shaking his hand briefly. This is Mike Chen, my construction consultant. He'll be conducting regular inspections from now on. The man, Tom, gave Mike a quick once-over, his expression neutral but his eyes calculating. Construction consultant? I wasn't aware we needed one. Our team is fully qualified. I'm sure they are, Lena said smoothly. But given the complexity of this project and the tight timeline, I thought additional oversight would be beneficial. For all of us. Tom's smile tightened. Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable, Ms. Wong. You're the boss. Yes, I am, she agreed, her tone pleasant but firm. Mike will need full access to all areas of the site and copies of all the current work orders. For the next 3 hours, they toured the massive building. Mike inspected ongoing work, checked materials against specifications, and observed the construction crews. He took notes in a small pad Lina had given him, occasionally stopping to ask questions of the foreman or workers. It quickly became clear to him that Tom, the project manager from the construction company, was indeed cutting corners, using lower-grade insulation than specified, skimping on the waterproofing membrane, installing fewer support beams than the plans called for. During a brief moment alone, Mike whispered to Lina, "He's hoping you won't notice these things until it's too late to fix them without major delays." Lina nodded, her expression grim. "Exactly why I needed you here." When they gathered in the temporary site office for a debriefing, the tension was palpable. Tom sat across the table, flanked by 2 of his supervisors. Lina and Mike sat side by side. "So," Tom said with forced cheerfulness, "what did you think of our progress?" Lina looked at Mike. "Would you like to share your observations, Mr. Chen?" Mike cleared his throat. For a moment, doubt crept in. Who was he to challenge these professionals? Just yesterday he'd been homeless, invisible. But then he remembered, before that, he'd been a damn good foreman. He knew his stuff. The northeast corner foundation reinforcement is using 6-inch I-beams instead of the 8-inch specified in the plans, he began, keeping his voice steady and matter-of-fact. The insulation being installed in the west wall is R13, not the R19 required by code for this type of building. The waterproofing membrane on the basement level is the economy grade, not the premium grade listed in the materials spec. He continued through his list, methodically pointing out each discrepancy, each corner cut. When he finished, the room was silent. Tom leaned forward, his friendly facade gone. "Some of these are supplier substitutions due to availability issues. Others are judgment calls made by experienced professionals in the field. Judgment calls that coincidentally all save you money while potentially compromising the building's integrity," Lina observed. "Ms. Wong, with all due respect, construction projects always involve adjustments." "I'm not interested in excuses, Tom," Lina cut in. "I'm interested in getting what I'm paying for. By tomorrow morning, I want a complete list of all deviations from the original specifications, along with a detailed plan for bringing everything up to code. If that means ripping out work already done, so be it." Tom's face flushed red. "That would put us weeks behind schedule." "That's not my problem," Lina replied calmly. "You signed a contract to deliver specific work to specific standards. Either you honor that contract, or I'll find someone who will." The meeting ended shortly after, with Tom stalking out, phone already to his ear. "He's calling his boss," Mike said as they walked back to Lina's car. "I know. And his boss will call me, probably within the hour." She didn't seem concerned. "Thank you for being so thorough. You were right about everything you suspected." "Just doing the job," Mike said, but he couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. As they drove away from the site, Lina glanced at him. "Where are you staying now?" The question caught him off guard. I got a room last night. Budget place over on 42nd. She nodded. "That's good for the short term. But you'll need something more permanent if you're going to be working regularly." The implication that this wasn't just a one-time gig hung between them. "I was thinking," she continued, "the waterfront project includes on-site management quarters, a small apartment for the building supervisor. It's already been renovated, but it's sitting empty until we hire someone for that position." Mike looked at her, not daring to hope. And I need someone trustworthy living there now, keeping an eye on things, especially after what we saw today." She kept her eyes on the road. "The job comes with the apartment. It would be temporary, of course, just during the construction phase. 6 months, maybe a year. He couldn't speak for a moment. A job. An apartment. A purpose. "You've known me less than a week," he finally said. "How do you know you can trust me?" Lena smiled slightly. "I'm a good judge of character. It's how I've survived in this business. Besides," she added more softly, "everyone deserves a second chance. I had mine once." As they pulled up to a stoplight, she reached into her briefcase and handed him a folder. The job description, the pay rate, information about the apartment. "Look it over. If you're interested, let me know tomorrow." The light turned green. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of possibility. That night, back in his hotel room, Mike read through the folder 3 times. Building supervisor. It was a real job with a real salary. The apartment wasn't fancy, just a studio with a small kitchen and bathroom, but it was clean, safe, private. His. If he took this job, if he accepted this chance, everything would change. It terrified him. After years on the street, he'd gotten used to expecting nothing, wanting nothing. Hoping was dangerous. Dreams could break you. But as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling: tomorrow could be different. Tomorrow could be the first day of a new life. All he had to do was say yes. The apartment was on the top floor of the warehouse, a corner unit with tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. As Lena unlocked the door and stepped aside to let Mike enter first, he felt a strange tightness in his chest, part excitement, part fear. "It's basic," Lena said, watching him take in the space. "But everything works. New plumbing, updated electrical, fresh paint." Basic was not the word Mike would have chosen. To him, after years of park benches and shelter cots, it looked like a palace. The main room was open concept, a living area that flowed into a small kitchen with new appliances. A door to the left led to a bathroom with gleaming white tile. Large windows offered views of the city skyline and the river beyond. "There's a bedroom through there," Lena pointed to another door. "It's not large, but it has a closet." Mike walked slowly around the apartment, running his fingers along the smooth countertops, looking out the windows, trying to process that this could be his home. His footsteps echoed slightly on the polished concrete floors. "The furniture is temporary," Lena continued. "Just basics from our staging inventory. You can replace it with your own things eventually." His own things. He almost laughed. Everything he owned was currently stuffed into a backpack and a canvas tote bag. "It's perfect," he said finally, his voice a little rough. "More than perfect." Lena smiled, seeming to understand all he wasn't saying. "There's a security system for the building, and you'd have keys to all the common areas. Part of the job is doing regular walkthroughs, checking that everything is secure, letting workers in when needed." Mike nodded. "I can do that." "I know you can." She placed a set of keys on the counter. "These are yours. There's also a company phone and tablet in the drawer, you'll need those for the job." He stared at the keys. "Just like that? Don't you need references, background checks, all that stuff?" Lena leaned against the counter. "Officially, yes. The HR department is preparing the paperwork. But the background check is just a formality. You might not like what it shows," Mike said quietly. "After the accident, after the pills. I made some bad choices. We all have chapters in our lives we'd rather not read out loud," Lena replied. "I'm more interested in the chapter you're writing now." Mike picked up the keys, felt their weight in his palm. "Why are you doing all this? Really?" Lena was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window. 27 years ago, I arrived in this country with my parents and nothing else. No money, no connections, barely any English. We lived in a one-room apartment with 2 other families. She turned back to him. One day, my father was at a bus stop, trying to figure out which bus to take to a job interview. He couldn't read the schedule. A stranger stopped and not only explained the routes but actually rode with him to make sure he got to the right place. My father got that job. It changed everything for our family. That's different, Mike said. That was just directions. No, Lena shook her head. It was dignity. Respect. Someone seeing him as a person, not just a problem or an inconvenience. She picked up her briefcase. The apartment comes with the job, Mike. But the job is real. I need someone with your skills and knowledge. So it's not charity, it's an opportunity. For both of us. After she left, Mike stood alone in the quiet apartment. The silence felt different from the tense quiet of the streets. It was peaceful, private. He set his backpack and tote bag on the floor by the couch, then walked to the refrigerator. Opening it, he found it stocked with basic groceries: milk, eggs, bread, fruit, cold cuts. In the cabinets were dishes, glasses, silverware, pots and pans. The bathroom held towels, soap, shampoo, all new. In the bedroom, the bed was made with clean sheets, a comforter, pillows. Everything he would need to start over. Mike sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed. Had it been only 4 days since he'd helped Lena pick up those papers on the street? 4 days from invisible to essential. From hopeless to this. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. Mike opened it to find a delivery man holding 2 large paper bags. Dinner delivery for Chen? For a moment, Mike just stared at him. Then he remembered, that was his name now. At least as far as Lena's company was concerned. That's me, he said, taking the bags. They smelled wonderful, rich with spices and warmth. Inside was a feast, containers of rice, vegetables, chicken, beef, soup. Enough for at least 3 meals. A note was stapled to one of the bags: thought you might be hungry. It's from my favorite place, hope you like Chinese food. Welcome to the team. L. He ate at the small dining table, using real plates and silverware, sitting in a real chair. Simple pleasures that had seemed unreachable just days ago. That night, showered and full, Mike lay in the comfortable bed and stared up at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet, the whole situation too surreal. What if this was a mistake? What if he couldn't do the job? What if his past caught up with him and ruined everything? The doubts circled like vultures. Years on the street had taught him that hope was dangerous, that good things didn't last, that it was safer to expect nothing. But as the first light of dawn filtered through the window, another thought pushed through the doubt: maybe this time would be different. Maybe Lena was different. Maybe he was different. The next morning, Mike showered, shaved, and put on clean clothes. He made coffee in the kitchen, real coffee, not the watered-down stuff from the shelter, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. His phone buzzed with a text message from Lena. Meeting with contractors at 9. Thought you might want to be there. He texted back immediately, I'll be ready. At exactly 8:45, he locked his apartment door behind him. His apartment. His door. His keys. As he walked down to meet Lena, Mike realized something had shifted inside him. The constant knot of tension in his stomach had loosened. For the first time in years, he felt like he was walking toward something, not just away from everything. The contractors were waiting in the makeshift office on the ground floor. Tom, the project manager who had tried to cut corners, had been replaced by a stern-looking woman in her 50s. Mike, this is Joy Powell, Lena introduced them. She'll be taking over as lead contractor on the project. Joy gave him a firm handshake. Ms. Wong tells me you know your stuff. Good. We need someone keeping an eye on quality control. The meeting was all business, revised timelines, corrected material orders, staffing adjustments. Mike took notes, asked questions, made suggestions. No one looked at him strangely. No one questioned his presence. He was just another professional doing his job. Afterward, as they walked through the site checking on the day's progress, Lena glanced at him. How does it feel? Mike considered the question. Strange, he admitted. Good strange, but still. I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that I don't belong here. That feeling has a name, Lena said. Imposter syndrome. I still get it sometimes, even after all these years. You? But you've built this whole company. You're successful. Success doesn't cure it, she said with a small smile. But proving yourself to yourself helps. 2 months passed, and with each day, Mike grew more comfortable in his new role. The routine gave structure to his life, something he desperately missed during his years on the street. Every morning, he woke at 6, made coffee, reviewed the day's construction schedule on his tablet, and did a walkthrough of the building before the crews arrived at 8. His knowledge proved invaluable as the renovation progressed. He caught problems before they became disasters, suggested more efficient approaches to complicated issues, and earned the respect of the construction teams with his hands-on expertise and fair treatment. Lena visited the site several times a week, and they would walk through the building together, discussing progress and challenges. Sometimes they would grab lunch afterward at a small sandwich shop around the corner. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond work. She told him about her teenage daughter who was applying to colleges, her passion for photography, her dream of someday building truly sustainable housing that anyone could afford. He shared memories of his small hometown, his love of baseball, his interest in astronomy that had begun as a child. They developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Mike still marveled at how quickly his life had transformed, from invisible to essential, from sleeping on park benches to having keys to a multi-million-dollar development project. But not everything was smooth sailing. One Tuesday morning, as Mike was checking the new electrical installations on the 3rd floor, a voice from his past stopped him cold. Mike? Mike Harris? Is that really you? He turned to find a man in a hard hat staring at him with clear recognition. It took Mike a moment to place him, Bobby Reynolds, a former co-worker from the construction company where he'd worked before his accident. Bobby, Mike said, his voice tight. Been a long time. Bobby looked him up and down, taking in the clean clothes, the company tablet in his hand, the supervisor badge clipped to his belt. Man, I heard you were, well, living rough. After everything that happened. Bobby shifted uncomfortably. But you look good. Real good. I got lucky, Mike said simply. You working here now? As what? Building supervisor. Quality control. Bobby nodded slowly. Good for you, man. Really? He hesitated. Listen, some of the guys and we always felt bad about how things went down after your accident. The company did you dirty. Mike had spent years being angry about that, how quickly they'd discarded him, how they'd fought his workers' comp claim, how none of his so-called friends had stuck by him when things got bad. Ancient history, he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. The anger was still there, but it had lost its sharp edge. Bobby shifted uncomfortably. Well, it's good to see you back on your feet. After Bobby left, Mike stood motionless for a long moment. The encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. It was as if two versions of himself, past and present, had collided, reminding him how fragile his new reality might be. That evening, he found himself walking back to his old corner near Central Park. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to remind himself of where he'd been. Maybe to prove to himself that he had truly moved on. The corner looked exactly the same bench, the same storefronts across the street, the same flow of people either ignoring or avoiding the small cluster of homeless men who now occupied the space. One of them, an older man with a gray beard and worn clothing, caught Mike's eye. For a moment it was like looking in a mirror to the past, what might have been his future if not for a chance encounter with flying papers and a compassionate woman. Without thinking, Mike crossed to a nearby deli, bought several sandwiches and bottles of water, and brought them to the men on the corner. He didn't say much, just offered the food and nodded when they thanked him. The older man studied him curiously. "You been out here before," he said. It wasn't a question. Mike nodded. "This was my spot. For almost 3 years. What changed?" "Someone saw me," Mike said simply. "Really saw me?" The man nodded, understanding in his eyes. No more words were necessary between them. As Mike walked back to the waterfront building, back home, he felt a curious sense of peace. The past was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He had been given a second chance, and he was making the most of it. When he reached the building, he was surprised to see Lena's car still in the parking lot. It was after 7, she usually left by 5. He found her in the main office, surrounded by blueprints and looking frustrated. "Everything okay?" he asked from the doorway. She looked up, seeming relieved to see him. "Not really. The city inspector is coming next week, and I just found out the plans for the accessibility ramps don't meet the updated code requirements. We need to revise them immediately or the whole project could be delayed." Mike stepped into the office, looking at the blueprints spread across the table. "Let me see." For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side, redrawing sections of the plans, calculating measurements, finding solutions that would meet code without requiring major structural changes. It was challenging, detailed work that required all of Mike's knowledge and experience. By the time they finished, it was nearly midnight. Lena leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. "We did it," she said with satisfaction. "These will pass inspection for sure." Mike nodded, studying their work. "It'll mean some extra construction time, but not much. Maybe a week. A week is better than the months it could have been." She gathered up the revised plans. "I couldn't have done this without you, Mike. You know that, right?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but pleased nonetheless. "Just doing my job." "No," she said firmly. "You're doing far more than the job description. You care about this project as much as I do. That's rare." As they walked out to the parking lot together, Lena hesitated beside her car. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something. The construction phase is going so well that we're ahead of schedule. We'll be ready for tenants sooner than expected." Mike nodded, waiting for her to continue. "The thing is," she went on, "once construction is complete, the building supervisor position changes. It becomes more about managing tenant relations, handling maintenance requests, that sort of thing." His heart sank. Was she trying to tell him that his position would end when construction was complete? That this had all been temporary after all? "I see," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Well, I appreciate everything you've done for me. These few months have given me a chance to get back on my feet, save some money." "Mike, stop," Lena interrupted. "I'm not letting you go. Just the opposite. I want to offer you a permanent position as property manager for the entire waterfront complex. It's a significant promotion, more responsibility, better salary, and—" She smiled, "a larger apartment." He stared at her, speechless. "The job requires someone who understands the building from the ground up, someone the tenants can trust, someone I can trust." She held out a folder. "All the details are in here. Think about it over the weekend." As Mike took the folder, their fingers briefly touched. In that moment, something shifted between them, a small, almost imperceptible change in the air. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for this. For everything." Lena held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. "You earned it, Mike. Every bit of it." As he watched her drive away, Mike realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was building a future. Spring arrived, bringing with it the final stages of the waterfront project. The building had been transformed, the crumbling brick exterior restored to its original glory, the interior spaces modernized while preserving the character of the old warehouse. Large windows gleamed in the sunlight, the once boarded-up facade now open and inviting. Mike stood on the rooftop garden, his latest contribution to the project. The idea had come to him one evening as he'd watched the sunset from his apartment window. The building had this massive, unused roof space with spectacular views. Why not turn it into something special for the residents? He'd presented the concept to Lena with detailed plans and a budget. She'd loved it immediately, authorizing the additional funds without hesitation. Now, raised planter beds filled with vegetables and flowers created winding paths across the roof. Benches and small seating areas provided quiet spots to enjoy the panoramic city views. A pergola covered in climbing vines offered shade for community gatherings. "It's even better than I imagined," Lena's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her walking toward him, elegant as always in her business attire but with a warmth in her eyes that was reserved for moments like this, moments of shared accomplishment. "The contractors did good work," Mike said, watching as she ran her hand along a wooden planter box. "Because you supervised them like a hawk," she replied with a smile. "This was your vision, Mike. You should be proud." He nodded, allowing himself to feel the satisfaction. "I am." They walked together along the garden paths, discussing the upcoming grand opening. The first tenants would begin moving in next month, a mix of retail businesses on the ground floor and residents in the apartments above. True to her word, Lena had dedicated 30% of the units to affordable housing, ensuring that the development would serve the community rather than just wealthy investors. "Have you thought more about the property manager position?" she asked as they reached the edge of the roof, looking out over the river. "I have," Mike said. Over the past weeks, he'd read through the job description countless times, weighing the responsibility against his capabilities. It was a big step up, managing staff, handling budgets, serving as the primary contact for all tenants. "I want to accept." Lena's face brightened. "I'm glad. You're the right person for this building, Mike. You understand it in a way no outside hire ever could. There's just one thing," he added, meeting her gaze. "I want to be completely honest with you and the company. About my past, my real name, everything. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it right." Lena nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. But you should know, I already ran a background check. You're a real one." Mike stared at her, stunned. "When?" "After the first week," she admitted. "I needed to know who I was trusting with my project. Your name is Michael Harris. You worked for Brightpath Construction for 15 years, rising to senior foreman. You were injured on the job saving a coworker's life. You filed for workers' compensation and disability but were denied on a technicality. You developed an addiction to pain medication, lost your apartment, and spent approximately 3 years homeless before our paths crossed." The clinical recitation of his life's worst chapter made Mike wince, but there was no judgment in her voice. "You knew all that, and you still hired me? Still trusted me with all this?" He gestured to the building below them. "I did," she said simply. "Because that background check also showed me a man who had never been arrested despite his circumstances, who had an impeccable work record before his accident, who was described by former colleagues as the most reliable person on the site." The facts of your past matter less to me than what you've demonstrated every day since I met you. Mike felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the fear of discovery, of losing everything if the truth came out. Thank you, he said quietly. There's something else, Lena continued, her voice taking on a more formal tone. The company is expanding. We're taking on 3 new development projects next quarter, all of them focused on affordable housing and community spaces. That's great, Mike said, genuinely pleased for her success. I'll need someone to oversee construction quality across all the projects. Someone with practical experience who can't be fooled by corner-cutting contractors. Someone who sees buildings not just as investments but as homes. She looked at him meaningfully. I'd like to create a new position, Director of Construction Quality. And I'd like to offer it to you. Mike was speechless. This wasn't just a job, it was a career. A future he couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. It would mean working closely with me, Lena added, a slight uncertainty in her voice. We make a good team, I think. There was something in her tone that went beyond professional appreciation. Mike felt it too, the connection that had been growing between them, cautiously, gradually, built on mutual respect but blooming into something more. We do, he agreed softly. Their eyes held for a long moment. Then Lena glanced at her watch and took a step back, professional composure returning. The board meeting is in an hour. I should go prepare. We can discuss the details of the position tomorrow, if you're interested. I am, Mike said. Very interested. She smiled, then hesitated. There's a dinner this weekend. For the project investors and key team members. As the building supervisor, you should be there. I don't exactly have clothes for that kind of event, Mike said, gesturing to his work clothes. We can fix that, Lena replied. Meet me tomorrow at noon. We'll go shopping. After she left, Mike stayed on the roof garden, watching the city below. 6 months ago, he'd been invisible to the people hurrying along those streets. Now he stood above them, part of something significant, making a difference. That evening, he did something he'd been putting off for weeks. He called his sister in Ohio. They hadn't spoken in nearly 4 years, not since she'd tried to help him after he lost his apartment and he'd pushed her away, ashamed to let her see what he'd become. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Hello? Her voice was exactly as he remembered. Jenny? It's Mike. Your brother. The words felt strange in his mouth. There was a long pause. Mike? Is it really you? Are you okay? Yeah, he said, his throat tight with emotion. Yeah, I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I've got a lot to tell you. As the sun set over the city, Mike sat by his apartment window and reconnected with the family he'd thought was lost to him forever. He told his sister everything, the accident, the homeless years, the chance meeting with Lena, the job, the new opportunity. She listened, cried, laughed, asked questions. I want to see you, she said finally. It's been too long. I'd like that, Mike replied. I have an apartment now. A nice one. You and the kids could stay here. If you wanted to visit. We will, she promised. Soon. After they hung up, Mike looked around his apartment, the place that had become home. On the coffee table lay the folder with the job offer. On the kitchen counter was his invitation to the investors' dinner. Signs of his new life, his second chance. And in his mind was the image of Lena's smile, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. Something was beginning there, something unexpected but welcome. Tomorrow, they would go shopping together. Tomorrow, he would accept her job offer. Tomorrow, his new life would take another step forward. For a man who had once lost all hope for tomorrow, it was nothing short of miraculous. 1 year later, Mike stood at the podium in front of a crowd gathered for the opening of Parkview Properties' newest development, an affordable housing complex on the city's east side. As Director of Construction Quality, he had overseen every aspect of the building process, ensuring that no corners were cut, no standards compromised. "This building isn't just about providing shelter," he said into the microphone, his voice steady despite his nerves. Public speaking still didn't come naturally to him, but he was getting better with practice. "It's about creating a community. A place where people can build their lives with dignity and hope." From the front row, Lena watched him with pride. Beside her sat Mike's sister Jenny and her 2 teenage children, who had moved to the city 3 months ago. After reconnecting with Mike, Jenny had decided to make a fresh start herself, leaving an unhappy marriage and taking a job as Parkview's new office manager, a position Lena had created when she learned of Jenny's situation. Also in the audience were faces from Mike's past life on the streets, the older man from his corner and several others. Over the past year, Mike had worked with Lena to develop a program that offered jobs in building maintenance and groundskeeping to people transitioning out of homelessness. Not everyone wanted the opportunity, and not everyone who tried succeeded, but for those who did, it provided the same kind of second chance that Mike had received. None of this would have been possible without Lena Wong, Mike continued, looking directly at her. She saw possibility where others saw only problems. She built bridges where others built walls. And she believed in people when they had stopped believing in themselves. Lena smiled up at him, her eyes shining. Their relationship had grown steadily over the past year, evolving from professional respect to friendship to something deeper. They had taken it slowly, both aware of the complexities, the differences in their backgrounds, the fact that she was technically his boss, the potential complications for her company. But the connection between them had proven stronger than all those concerns. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as the crowd dispersed for the reception, Mike found himself back at the podium, looking out at the empty seats. It was still hard to believe sometimes, how completely his life had transformed in just 18 months. "Penny for your thoughts," Lena said, coming up beside him. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied. "This is the 3rd building we've opened this year. And each one better than the last," she agreed, slipping her hand into his. The gesture still gave him a thrill. "The community program is getting national attention. 2 other developers have contacted me about implementing similar initiatives." Mike nodded, proud of what they'd accomplished together. The waterfront model, as it was becoming known, combined quality housing with community support services and employment opportunities. It wasn't just charity, it was a sustainable approach to addressing homelessness by providing both housing and dignity. "There's something I've been wanting to show you," Lena said, tugging gently at his hand. "Can you slip away for a little while?" They drove across town, away from the new development and toward a neighborhood Mike didn't immediately recognize. When they pulled up in front of an old, boarded-up community center, he gave Lena a questioning look. "Come on," she said, getting out of the car and walking toward the building. Inside, the space was dusty and neglected, but Mike could see the potential immediately: high ceilings, large windows, an open floor plan. "The city is selling it," Lena explained as they walked through the space. "It's been abandoned for years, but the structure is sound. I was thinking it could be our next project." "Another housing development?" Mike asked, mentally calculating the number of units that could fit in the space. "No," Lena said, turning to face him. "Something different. A skills training center. A place where people can learn trades, construction, electrical work, plumbing, carpentry. The kinds of skills that can't be outsourced, that will always be in demand." Mike nodded slowly, seeing the vision. "A place where people like me could get back on their feet." "Exactly." Lena's eyes were bright with excitement. "But I need someone to run it. Someone who understands both the technical aspects and the human element. Someone who's been there." The implication hung in the air between them. This wouldn't just be another project, this would be his project. His chance to create something from the ground up that could help others find their way back from the edge. You want me to run it? He asked, wanting to be sure. Lena nodded. As executive director. It would be a separate non-profit, partnered with but independent from Parkview. Your own organization. The offer took his breath away. It was perfect, combining his construction knowledge with his lived experience, allowing him to help others in a meaningful, sustainable way. I've been working on the business plan, Lena continued, pulling a folder from her bag. There's seed funding available from the city for workforce development, and several of our investors have expressed interest in supporting social impact initiatives. Mike took the folder, but instead of opening it, he set it aside on a dusty windowsill. Then he took both of Lena's hands in his. Before I say yes, and I am going to say yes, there's something I need to tell you. Her expression grew curious. What is it? This past year working with you, being with you, it's been the best year of my life. Not because of the job or the apartment or any of the material things. Because of you. Because you saw me when I was invisible. Because you treated me with respect when I had forgotten what that felt like. Lena squeezed his hands, her eyes softening. Mike. Let me finish, he said gently. I know we come from different worlds. I know your board of directors probably has concerns about us being together. I know there are a million reasons why this might be complicated. But I love you, Lena Wong. And if you'll have me, I want to build more than buildings with you. I want to build a life. For a moment, Lena was silent, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then she reached up and placed her palm against his cheek. Do you know what I saw that first day, when you helped me gather those papers? I saw kindness. Care. Integrity. All the things I value most. She smiled. The worlds we come from don't matter. It's the world we're creating together that counts. She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him softly. And yes, I'll have you. In fact, I think I've been waiting for you all my life. As sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of what would become their next shared project, Mike held Lena close, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. From a chance encounter on a street corner to this moment of shared purpose and love, it was more than a second chance. It was a new beginning. And in that moment, the man who had once been invisible found himself seen, valued, and loved for exactly who he was. Their story would continue to unfold, touching more lives, creating more opportunities, building more bridges. But one thing was certain, they would walk that path together, hand in hand, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness.